Harold Cooper was a low-key man. At 78 years old, his face bore the marks of time, and his serene posture bore the calm of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. That Tuesday morning, he was wearing a simple gray suit jacket, worn-out shoes, and a leather briefcase that looked older than many of the passengers around him. The flight was leaving New York for Los Angeles, and Harold, as he always did, chose first class. Not for show, but for comfort. He had crossed the country hundreds of times in silence, always sitting next to the window, listening to jazz on his headphones and reading printed reports. In the priority boarding line, he noticed the sidelong glances of some younger passengers and a flight attendant who frowned as if he were in the wrong place. But he carried on as he always did, discreet, polite, invisible. Once inside the plane, Harold calmly made his way to seat 1A. He placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, sat down, and pulled his boarding pass from his pocket to check his estimated arrival time. That was when two flight attendants approached. Their expressions were clear: confusion, distrust, and a certain disdain. One of them asked to see his ticket. Harold kindly handed him the ticket, but barely had time to explain. The flight attendant was already discreetly signaling to an airport security agent as if she were dealing with an intruder. Within minutes, Harold was surrounded, treated as if he had invaded first class by mistake or bad faith. They ignored his calm attempts at dialogue, snatched his carry-on bag from the compartment, and led him off the plane. The embarrassment was public, humiliating, and no one, absolutely no one, there bothered to ask who he was. The voice on the other end was Charles Danner, CEO of HC Partners, the operating arm of one of the largest hedge funds in the country. Charles answered with his usual energy, without any idea of the reason for the call. Harold didn't need to elaborate. He was the founder, the chairman, and the real brains behind the empire he had helped build from scratch, and when he gave an order, he wasn't questioned. "I want you to divest all investments from Global Sky Airlines, now," he said, his tone measured. Charles hesitated for a second, not because of the content of the order, but because of the way Harold said it, without anger, without haste, just with a cold conviction that left no room for doubt. The impact of this decision was colossal, something like $4 billion in equity, stock, and strategic agreements that would be pulled out overnight, like a rug pulled out from under the feet of someone who sleeps standing up. As Charles began to move behind the scenes to execute the decision, Harold returned to the airport lounge and sat in silence. There was no drama in his actions. He did not complain to the airline attendants, did not raise his voice, or even mention the egregious mistake they had made. But inside him, something had changed. It was not just about the denied seat or the humiliation he had suffered. It was about the greater symbol of it all, the way they had treated someone who, in their eyes, seemed unworthy. That was what hurt the most. For decades, Harold had built his career by listening more than talking, studying more than showing off. He had never needed titles hanging on the wall or flashes of recognition. Now, after a lifetime of achievement, he had been reduced to just another old man lost in the wrong aisle. And that, to him, was unacceptable. By early afternoon, as Harold sat sipping coffee in a nearby hotel lounge, the first ripples were already rippling through the airline's boardroom. The sudden exit of the HC Partners Fund was like a silent earthquake. No one had been warned, and the numbers began to plummet in real time. Global Sky's shares fell more than 18% in less than 2 hours, and executives at the company went into crisis mode. The company's CEO, a famous and conceited figure named Brian Caulfield, was alerted while he was attending an international awards event. At first, he dismissed the warning as an exaggeration. "It's just another financial maneuver," he told his advisors. But when he saw the actual numbers and internal reports about the breakdown of the partnership with HC Partners, he realized that something serious had been triggered and that it was beyond his control. What Brian and most of the company's top brass didn't know was the reason behind the fund's pullback. They tried to contact the CEO of HC Partners, but could only reach Charles Danner, who simply repeated that it was a strategic and irrevocable decision. Harold, on the other hand, remained anonymous. He gave no interviews, posted nothing on social media, or even talked to anyone about the matter. He just watched. That was how he had always won, quietly, without fanfare, letting the effects speak for themselves. The damage to the company was growing like a crack in glass. It would start out discreet, almost invisible, but soon spread out of control. And Harold knew that the crack wasn't just financial, it was reputational, structural, and most importantly, moral. It was the consequence of a culture that judged by what you see, not by who you are. The next morning, the main economic portals were already carrying headlines about the billion-dollar split between HC Partners and Global Sky. Experts tried to understand the fund's motivation, and investors began to speculate about possible internal failures at the airline. The market does not forgive uncertainty, and the lack of concrete explanations caused panic. The share price plummeted even further, while commercial partners demanded guarantees. Within hours, companies that had long-term contracts with Global Sky contacted them to renegotiate or cancel agreements. The company, which until then had boasted stability and prestige in the sector, was now facing its first major reputational crisis in more than a decade, and all of this caused by a man who had never even raised his voice. Harold, back in the private office he kept on the top floor of HC Partners, watched everything through the large window. The city went on as it was, indifferent to what was happening behind the scenes in the corporate world. He wasn't seeking revenge in the traditional sense. What he wanted, deep down, was for someone there to feel what he had felt on that plane. The feeling of being disposable, of not being taken seriously, of being treated as if he had no value. It was more than a settling of scores. It was a course correction. He knew that many would say he was exaggerating, that it was just an operational error, that no one meant to offend him. But Harold had lived long enough to understand that the worst kind of contempt is not the kind that comes with offensive words, but the kind that comes with cold looks, gestures, and decisions, which hurt more than shouting. Throughout the day, the press began to speculate that the origin of Global Sky's collapse was linked to an internal incident with a high-level investor. Some outlets suggested a disagreement between executives, while others considered a serious mistake by the company in some confidential negotiation. None of them had any idea that it all started with a disrespectful approach inside an airplane cabin. No journalist until then had linked Harold's presence on the flight to the silent downfall that was taking place, and that was how he preferred it, invisible but active. Meanwhile, the company's board of directors began to divide. Conflicts arose, internal accusations and emergency meetings followed one after the other. Some directors began to ask for leave, trying to dissociate themselves from the crisis. Others tried desperately to save the company's image in the eyes of shareholders. But the damage had already been done. While everyone was searching for answers, Harold went about his daily routine as if nothing was happening. He would carry his briefcase, walk to his office, have lunch at the same discreet restaurant on the ground floor of the building, and return before 2 p.m. He showed no euphoria or pride, just a firm conviction that he was doing the right thing. It wasn't about the money. He knew that the billions he had taken from the company could have been allocated to other companies long ago. But like everything in life, he always knew when to act. And more importantly, he knew when to teach a lesson. That week, it wasn't just Global Sky that was suffering losses. The CEO himself, Brian Caulfield, began to be exposed by former employees who brought to light episodes of arrogance, bullying, and questionable decisions. It was as if the system itself was paying the price for years of arrogance. On the third day after the investment was withdrawn, Brian Caulfield finally learned who the man who had started the whole storm was. He was handed a complete dossier with the name Harold James Cooper prominently displayed, followed by pages and pages of corporate history, achievements, awards, and discreet appearances on the boards of major conglomerates. The CEO read it all in silence, each line like a punch in the gut. It was as if he had thrown a wolf in sheep's clothing off his plane, and now he was watching his own empire crumble because he had failed to recognize the danger. More than that, he had scorned a man who, behind his simple exterior, carried more power than any executive in an expensive suit on that plane. For the first time in years, Brian felt fear, real fear. Not of losing his job, but of having exposed his weakness to someone who would never forget it. As the chaos unfolded, Harold received a call from the CEO of another airline. A generous proposal, almost begging him to redirect his investments, promising more humane service standards and an institutional stance based on respect and inclusion. He thanked them, but declined. He wasn't looking for a new partner. The lesson wasn't about money, it was about attitude. And he didn't want to be the symbol of a market dispute or to be seen as a bitter old billionaire. What Harold wanted, and now he could feel, was for people to start rethinking how they treat others, especially those they think don't fit in, especially those who walk in silence. It wasn't revenge, it was quiet justice, and sometimes justice doesn't shout, it just acts. A few weeks later, Harold was at the same airport, Terminal B, Gate 32. This time, he wouldn't be flying with any well-known airline. He would be flying by private jet at the invitation of an old business partner. While he was waiting, he saw a group of employees from another airline helping an elderly man who was having trouble getting around. It was a simple scene that went unnoticed by most people, but not by him. It was exactly this kind of gesture that made a difference. Harold didn't believe in advertising campaigns or public apologies. He knew that many companies only changed under pressure. But he also knew that every now and then, someone really learned. And it was because of these small possibilities that it was still worth continuing to bet on people, even after everything. Global Sky, on the other hand, was never the same. It tried to stem the crisis with formal announcements, changes in the executive board, and public apologies that sounded rehearsed. But the damage was done. Investor confidence evaporated, the stock plummeted to the lowest level in the company's history, and Brian Caulfield was forced to resign under heavy pressure from the board. To most, it seemed that he had fallen because of a strategic error. Only a few knew that it all started with a gesture of contempt, with an attitude that lasted less than 5 minutes, but that triggered consequences that were impossible to contain. The corporate world, so accustomed to judging by appearances, had learned a hard lesson. Underestimating someone can cost you dearly, very dearly. Harold never spoke publicly about what happened. He never gave interviews, refused all attempts to get in touch with the press, and maintained his usual routine. He continued to go to the office, although less frequently. He took care of his social projects and enjoyed his days without rushing. For him, all that had ended the moment the aircraft door closed in front of his face. What came after was just a consequence. Still, every now and then, when he was alone in the late afternoon, he would think about the scene, the looks, the coldness, the way he had been treated like an intruder. He didn't feel angry. He felt alert, a reminder that the world still needed more attention, more care, more humility. On the last line of the last report that month, Harold handwrote a short sentence, as he often did. The way we treat others when we think they have nothing to offer us says everything about who we are. Then he closed the folder, turned off the lights in the room and walked out without looking back. He knew he couldn't change the entire world. But that month, with a single silent gesture, he had changed the course of a giant, exposed the weakness of an arrogant CEO, and reminded everyone that true power lies not in the volume of one's voice, but in the firmness of one's self-explanation.